Okay, welcome. We're here today, September 22nd, 2019, in Bloomington, Indiana, and I'm David Sutton, and I'm here with Joelle Bahloul, who is Professor Emeritus at Bloomington, Emeriti, at Indiana University, Bloomington, and this is the third in a series of interviews on the development of food anthropology, sponsored by the Society for the Anthropology of Food and Nutrition. And Joelle, I've probably told you, but your work was important to me when I started thinking about food of memory in the late 1990s. Mm-hmm. And you were one of the very few people who had written about that, at least touched on it ethnographically. Mm-hmm. But we'll get to that. But sure. I want to start with.
You surpassed me.
Oh. Anyway, I want to start with your background and training and how you first thought about your PhD research and who were the people who supported you and inspired you, mm-hmm. and how you first started thinking about food.
Okay. That happened in the mid to late 70s, mm-hmm. when I was a student at the University of Paris in the Sorbonne. Okay. And later on, when I became a graduate student in anthropology, social anthropology, at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. So everything happened in there, because mm-hmm. that's where I got my training. So, I started my academic career because I wanted to study anthropology. So at the time it was called ethnology. And I developed an interest in ethnosciences. I don't remember the exact point, but I guess I was interested in a variety of subjects. First in Jewish studies, it was a time when one is looking for her identity. So I was attracted to the anthropology of colonialism, mm-hmm. which I took courses on as an undergraduate student at the Sorbonne. And then progressively I moved into the subject of ethnosciences, ethnobotany, ethnozoology, because I became interested in why in my family most of the Jewish ritual was part of domestic religion. Really, most of my Jewishness, I acquired it there, because I didn't go to religious school. My parents were not particularly religious. Part of our diet at home was not kosher. Mm-hmm. We lived it happily, with no sense of guilt. And so I started to realize that my Jewish identity was probably grounded in domestic ritual, in which food rituals, gatherings around the table of the family, etc., were absolutely central. And I had learned a lot of my interest for cooking, which has become really steady to this day, from looking at my mother's cooking in the kitchen, and the preparation of Jewish holidays, starting, Thursday evening, the preparation of Sabbath happened to me more dramatically at home than in the synagogue. So, because of my interest in anthropology, I started to take courses in ethnobiology, ethnosciences, ethnobotanics particularly. And when I applied for the doctoral program at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, at the time, now it's probably different, the procedure of applying, but you had to have, in order to be accepted in a program, in a doctoral program, you had to have an advisor. So first you do the shopping, and so I went to talk with a man who eventually became my advisor, Jacques Bahloul, who was a professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and he was teaching ethnosciences. And so he was an agronomist turned into an agroanthropologist who used to work in New Caledonia. Right. Okay? And he had a very deep experience with farmers there, native farmers, of course. And so he was teaching at the école, and Jacques Bahloul, immediately said yes to my project. Okay? But something I need to tell you, I did not start with working on Jewish cuisine, actually. I started, this was my master's research, because I went through the master's before I went to the doctorate. And I did my master's at the Sorbonne, not at the École, I believe. No, at the École, I'm sorry. And my master's was on macrobiotics, because this is a movement that started to develop at the time in France with a Japanese guru that used to come and give seminars in very interesting places. So I decided to do my master's thesis on that, and then the first year of my doctorate, this is my ethnographic project. And I participated in a couple of seminars that this Japanese guru, which name I forget, of course, he probably died a long time ago. He gave this seminar in the Alps, in a little village in the Alps, and a number of people went there. So I did ethnography of that. And also I did ethnography of the macrobiotic movement. In Paris, there were restaurants and there were groups. There was a community. Okay, so I did a lot of interviews there. So I wrote my master's thesis on how macrobiotics was a food project that was supposed to change society. At the time, so that was the late 70s, a lot of people, including among my friends, thought that these macrobiotic people were crazy.
Right.
And now, of course, when I think about the development of vegetarianism, and I have not followed up about the fate of the macrobiotic movement, but I'm sure they are still around. But when you think about the organic food movement and all that happened in the past 30 years, this is a success for the macrobiotic people. Okay. But I learned a lot doing this ethnography about how people plan to change society by changing their diet.
Right.
So eating was not only a matter of feeding, okay? Because these people, there were some people I remember who had major health problems, cancer, and they were planning to find a cure in the macrobiotic diet. Some of them did.
Right.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So I worked, at the crossroads of social anthropology and nutrition studies, if you wish, some of which had some medical, implications, of course. But so that's the life I had as a graduate student in the late 70s in Paris, interested in food. And then I took courses in ethnobotany, for a few years. As I told you before, I worked with a great scientist, André-Georges Audricourt, who was an ethnobotanist, a former agronomist, a linguist, a student and friend of Marcel Mauss, and whose classes really, and they were seminar oriented, if you wish, because there were very few students, a group of 10, 12 students for most, some of whom were working with him as their advisor. And he knew everything about, he wrote a number of books, I just printed the bibliography, about how people, societies and cultures relate to the plant world and organize their society and their culture, particularly their language, according to that relation to plants. And I would never forget the course on coriander, which in my family, they didn't call it coriander, they called it Arab parsley.
Arab parsley.
Yeah. Some people here call it Chinese parsley as well. But in my family, they called it Arab parsley and...
what we call cilantro.
Right.
Yeah.
So this class was about the different names of coriander. And Audricourt, who was teaching that class and who was in his, I guess in his 50s at the time, had a sense of humor like you would not believe it. He was so funny. And he said, when I said that in my family we eat a lot of coriander, my mother uses a lot of coriander in her cuisine, he said that coriander is a plant that many people have a fixation on because they hate it or they love it. So my family was in the group of people who love coriander, and some people hate it. I never understood that, frankly, even as an anthropologist.
Right.
And he said that people who hate coriander feel that it has a cockroach flavor. And I kept thinking, well, do they know the flavor of cockroaches? But anyway, so we were talking about all the human imagination about plants, which was absolutely remarkable. And then we had field trips with Audricourt, which I will never forget, with a professor going into forests in the surrounding of Paris to find specific plants that he had a fixation on, when they bloom at the very particular time in spring when these plants bloom. And we would walk for hours around these forests, and we were all tired, and Audricourt made fun of our fatigue, and then all of this ended up in a very nice country restaurant. And then at the end of the day, so that's how I developed my interest on food. But I have to say that because I started to work on Jewish dietary laws and the food practices among Sephardic immigrants in France. And so the Jewish dietary laws are focused on animals. So it's really a certain type of ethnozoology. Mm-hmm. Okay. Then I started to read Mary Douglas, And Mary Douglas was really a great inspiration to me. I eventually met her both in Paris and in the United States. She was delighted that a young anthropologist like me would get interested in her book, Purity and Danger. She couldn't believe it, I felt. But, you know, in that book, she essentially wrote my dissertation, I felt. Because everything she wrote in there, I found it in specific recipes. I can tell you later. But she was a great inspiration, definitely. Right. I remember, as an undergraduate student, the professor, I took a class on anthropology and colonialism, something like that. So that must have been in 1974, okay? The professor had books by Mary Douglas in his bibliography. And at the time, her book had not been translated yet. And so I remember going around Paris libraries to find the only copy that existed at the time of Purity and Danger, and then the Lily of the Kassai that she published before, I believe. I went around Paris to find that book. We didn't have Amazon at the time, so I couldn't buy it or anything. You know, it was only libraries. And so that gives you an idea.
Yeah.
So I think that my interest in the anthropology of food really started at the very beginning of my academic career, and it was inspired by scholars, professors, and research communities that I navigated in.
I see. So you had these two great professors doing ethnobotany and ethnoscience, and then you were thinking about Mary Douglas, but you were also influenced by the Annals school that was prominent.
Yes, that's when I went to grad school at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. The École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, which I started in 1977, was dominated by the Annals School in Social and Cultural History. Dominated. It's no longer the case now, but at the time it was very much dominated. And one of my professors suggested that I work with Lucette Valency, who is a social historian, very close to social anthropology indeed, of the Muslim world, particularly North Africa. And so I went to see her, and she immediately accepted to work with me and to take me in her seminar. She used to teach a seminar. So I became a member of her family of young scholars who used to go to her seminar, even if they were no longer students, actually. And to this day, she's a friend of mine, you know. Now, Lucette Valency was a major actor in the Annals School because she was the editor of the Annals Review, okay, who was dominant at the École des Hautes Études. At the time, the reason why this happened is because of the development under Braudel and Marc Bloch of the theory of history in the longue durée, against the event-oriented history. And so because of that theory, indicating that history is made in the bottom and not at the top of society, obviously the obvious relation was to work with social anthropologists and ethnographers. And you had seminars at the time at the École that combined both social historians and social anthropologists. This was really very common. And so I learned a lot about the history, Jewish history, through this lens. And I have to say that at the time, Jewish studies had not done this step at all. You know, it had remained oriented by event-oriented history. So social history, eventually it made an entry into Jewish history, but long after that. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, the thing is that in this Annales School of Social History, there was a lot of focus on domestic history, okay? And so you had a group of people who were working on food, the history of food in different societies and cultures at different periods of time, including Jean-Louis Flandrin, for example, who published a book that became important, and Jean-Paul Aron, and a variety of other people whose name I don't come to my mind right now. And so social anthropologists started to use history in their work on specific food practices, etc., etc. So, you know, my work on Sephardic immigrants, because these people had experienced colonialism and migration, of course, as a result of the same process, I became extremely influenced by social history because I was working with social historians. And that led me to memory, because those people were starting to, actually they were very deep into the study of oral history. Mm-hmm. So that there was a trend that started to question the historical value of written archives, okay, depending on the political institution that was that had produced these archives. Yeah. And so now oral history became part and parcel of the methodology of social history, because they were confronting data collected among witnesses of different periods that they were studying with written archives, okay? And so from the concept of oral history came the concept of collective memory. I was very much involved in those seminars working on collective memory. A lot of them, of course, were giving a new value to the work of Maurice Halbwachs. I mean, everybody was reading Halbwachs. It was, right, you know, published again, all his work. And I discovered Halbwachs, and the thing is that, you know, I realized that in my own family, there was a lot of talk during holidays, etc., about my grandfather's house in Algeria, because each time I would participate in a holiday in a family, I'm talking about the extended family on my mother's side, people were talking about that house. They gave it a name, and so my interest, you know, how does that happen in the unconscious of a scholar? I don't know, you know, or this is a different story. But I found that in my own family, I could find what I had studied in the work of Halbwachs. And so I became interested in collective memory, and I did this study. It was quite an experience, I have to say, because I went back to Algeria as I was observing a Jewish pilgrimage, actually, that happened in Constantine, which is about 70 kilometers away from my mother's native town. So, and this pilgrimage...
Which is Sétif?
Sétif.
Yes.
So I left the people who had come for the pilgrimage, and I took a taxi that took me to my grandfather's house. And I was by myself. And I did that. I remember the people, they were French Jews of Constantine origins. They told me, don't go, wait until one of us can actually go with you, it's dangerous. I didn't listen to them, and that's the production of this. Okay? So I took a taxi. The taxi driver, he took me from Constantine to Sétif. And he was sort of paternalizing me, because he thought that he would follow me wherever I go so that I would never be in danger at any time. I was 28, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so I gave him the address. And I told him to. So he said, I'm going to wait for you and I'll take you back to Constantine. So I get into that house. There's a big gate. And get in there. And there were some women in the courtyard working on different chores. And one of them came to me and she asked me who I was looking for. And so what was I going to tell her? Simply speaking. So I had already started to interview members of my family for this book, okay? Mm-hmm. And they had drawn, each of them had drawn a map of the house with names of people who resided in each room. And so when she asked me that question, I picked a name and I said, I want to see this woman. The woman was there 17 years after the fact, I think. Okay? And so she comes to me with a very old lady. And she said, I'm Zahiya, or I forget her name now. And who are you? So I had not prepared that at all, That was purely motivated by my guts. So I had not prepared that because it became an ethnographic expedition. Yeah. But so I told her, I'm the granddaughter of Braham Fitoussi. Now, that old lady starts to jump and ululate and caress my arms. And a group of women come to me. It was as if, my grandfather, who is buried there, not in the house, but in the town, in the cemetery, was returning. And they gave me a tour of the house.
These were the former Muslim neighbors of your...
Yes. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them were. And they gave me a tour of the house, telling me in each corner what my grandfather, my aunts, my mother was doing, every corner. It was a sort of dive into memory. I mean, it was a moment when I felt that collective memory was a miraculous human invention. And I had it in front of my eyes.
Well, that's one of the things that stands out reading your book, The Architecture of Memory, which is that memory is really like an actor in the story. You actually write with memory as the subject of sentences, and that's really striking and interesting. It's also really interesting that you're focusing on domestic memory, as you say.
Of course, because it's a house.
It's and I guess we should say that it's not, it's a large house which would have housed a number of different families together. So
Right.
there were Jews and Muslims living
Absolutely.
together
Living
there.
together, right. Yeah.
And so that,
And this was not unique, by the way.
Right.
In that area of town, there were a few houses like this that in which both Jews and Muslims cohabitated.
I see.
So, but anyway.
And I just, one of the things that stands out when I first read it, if I can just read it to you, you say that the remembered house is a small-scale cosmology symbolically restoring the integrity of a shattered geography. And I think that's really beautiful and striking, yeah. So...
You know, I was struck on my face with that, believe me.
Yeah.
Of course, I was studying collective memory in Paris when I did that. And the next year, I received a letter from one of the families that had lived with my grandfather, but had moved to another house. And they wrote me a letter telling me it was not the next year, actually it was a couple of months later. They sent me a letter to my Parisian address, and they said, we know that you visited the house. It was called Dar Ahmemo, but you know, I've changed the name in the book. And we would like you to come back. And so I did. Mm. I went to my advisor and I explained to him the situation. He said, I'm going to find you funding for that. Within a week, he got the funding and I went.
Right. And so you were, as we said, really focusing on the memory of this house, this domestic memory, which was mostly being held by women. And,
yes.
And so it's interesting in your book that you really get at both women's symbolic subordination in some ways, but also their control of this story through memory.
Absolutely.
And of course,
absolutely,
food was a big part of that. So even though you were interested in food before, you couldn't have avoided.
But you know, again, it was not a theorized kind of initiative for me. I felt I was taken by that. Right. You know, they drew me into it. But of course, you know, I was well prepared intellectually, I guess, you know, after you read Hadvax. But I'm not kidding, because I have taught a course on memory and culture at IU, at Indiana University, several years. And of course, you know, guess which book was central in the bibliography. So I forced the American students to read Hadvax. Now, the field of the anthropology of collective memory, the social scientific study of collective memory actually developed quite drastically, you know, in the past 10, 15 years, I would say.
Right. So one of the interesting things in reading your work to me is the role of kind of the division between the ritual and the ordinary, the everyday, which really plays out certainly in food practices. Yeah. It's striking to me because you know, as somebody interested in, well, I was looking at Greek Orthodox ritual practice, and there I saw a lot of actual continuity or flowing in. The everyday and the ritual were kind of often kind of interconnected, whereas what you described for this Jewish, Sephardic Jewish community, they even kind of, you describe, have a curtain to separate
which is a fragile boundary.
This boundary between what you use, even the cooking implements that you use for the daily meal and
Right.
the ones that you use for the Sabbath meal.
Right.
Could you
Well,
talk about that?
One has to realize that the Jews of Algeria, in particular, in general the North African Jews, but particularly Algeria, they have been for a century now in a very strong desire to become French citizens. And they were ready, in order to be considered French citizens fully, they had to make some transactions in their daily life on their body. Okay? The implication of the body into social political emancipation is dramatic. Okay? So for that, they had to modify their diet and to let some even non-kosher food enter their diet, but not in religious rituals. So the boundary, they established a boundary between their Frenchness and their Jewishness in order to be considered full-fledged citizens, French citizens, but not surrender their Jewish traditions completely. I have to say that nowadays there has been, in this kind of process of Frenchification through the body, there has been a lot of developments in the past several decades. First of all, because the generation that was born in France did not know, except through their parents' narratives, about the challenges of migration and colonial wars and all these upheavals that people like me have experienced, and our parents, of course. And so you have, I have observed in these communities, although, they're no longer North African communities, really, because there has been a lot of marriages with Ashkenazic Jews. I mean, all of this is integrated, but so there have been two different routes taken. So the religious route, in which you see people who were children of the families I describe in the book, who have chosen to become Orthodox Jews, even at the risk of getting somehow estranged from their parents. Okay, ultra-Orthodox route. Okay, Lubavitchers, etc., etc. Now, the majority of the Lubavitcher community in France is Sephardic, by the way, okay? And you have the other route that took the opposite trajectory completely. So eventually they got married with non-Jews, and they progressively abandoned rituals, okay? Did not transmit a lot of the ritual traditions to their children. In the middle, there are few people, sometimes they come back through the process of collective memory, through food and memory. But the principal strategy was to become a French citizen. And so in order to do that, they had to change their taste, First, they changed their language, so Judeo-Arabic disappeared from daily usage and became, or remained in food names, of dishes and especially dishes or food items. But it's not just a pure chance that cilantro was called Arab parsley. But anyway, so you have this kind of return to the food traditions from people who have abandoned most of the dietary laws, for that matter. And then a lot of things happen in the food market, in the kosher food market as well. But anyway, but the principle was to become a French citizen. Now, their children, my generation's children, they did not have that challenge because they were born French citizens. Nobody challenged them in that. While my generation and my parents' generation particularly, they were denied of their French citizenship during the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So that was a major trauma. The Vichy government just annulled the Décret Crémieux that was voted in 1870 and gave the French citizenship to all Jews of Algeria. So for 4 years, Jews were kicked out of public schools, of public functions, jobs, etc., etc. So that was a trauma. Yeah. And I think the negotiation in food and dietary practices in general with the French culture is a result of that trauma. Never challenge French citizenship and the belonging to European cultures.
So they were, you talk about they were eating pork, but they were eating it at restaurants, which isn't surprising. I know that tradition from New York Jewish culture that you eat pork at Chinese restaurants.
Right.
But
so you never cook them.
But you also
in your
describe
pots.
them bringing the pork home sometimes, as long as it's not cooked in the pot.
Absolutely. And there I found the distinction, the Lévi-Strauss distinction between the raw and the cooked, pretty obvious to use, you know. So the French culture in the kitchen, in the Jewish kitchen, is in the domain of nature.
Uh-huh.
And the Jewish culture, the Jewish food or the cuisine, the kosher cuisine, is in the domain of culture.
Because ham isn't considered cooked in the same way?
No, because it's bought as is and you don't cook it.
Right.
You can eat it in regular dishes, but you don't cook it, so it's not considered cooked, even if it is, of course, technically. What counts is the imagination of ham rather than its actual existence.
Right. Right. And then another thing that your work really touches on there is the sensory aspects of these memories, and that's what was really striking.
Of course, you did much more than I did in that aspect.
Well, as I said, I was reading some of your descriptions as I was thinking about these things, and especially how you talk about kind of some of the sensory aspects of the Sabbath meal, how there was almost a kind of way that the cooking paralleled the sense of time in the Sabbath, this kind of slowing down of time.
Right.
And all of
Yes.
that. And those were some really, I think you were talking about is it tefina?
Tefina.
Tefina.
Yeah, that's the typical. It's a Sephardic chulent, North African chulent, the tefina.
And it's cooked over Friday night for the Sabbath.
Right. I mean, it used to be. I don't know what they do now, but they have specific stoves that they turn on Friday night, and they cook their dishes all night long, and they eat the dishes the next day, for lunch. And they turn it off on Saturday evening at the end of Sabbath.
I see.
I'm talking about the Orthodox Jews, of course.
Right.
But, in old times, they used to actually bury bury the whole pot where they had put all the ingredients in burning coal. You know. And actually, the Moroccan name for that same dish is skhina, which means in Arabic the hot one.
Huh.
And there's another one, tfina, I think. I don't give. There's another word in Arabic that is the name of that dish that means the buried. Okay? So there is this idea that you bury your body into God, I guess, during these 24 hours.
I see.
Yeah.
And then another really striking image to me that you write about is this idea of that there are certain names of foods that are sacred, and that you actually taste the meaning of these names. I think you're talking about.
That's for the Rosh Hashanah dinner.
Yeah, the dates.
Eating the words.
Yes, you say when tasting the date, the eater tastes the word eradicate our enemies in Hebrew.
Well, because when you eat the date, you recite a blessing typical of Rosh Hashanah in which you ask God to eradicate the enemies. And in the Hebrew word eradicate, there is how should I say, phonetic closeness to the name of the date in Arabic. Okay, tamar. And the word eradicate in Hebrew is itamu.
Right.
So essentially, when you eat the date and you recite the prayer, you eat sacred words.
Right. That's such a beautiful synesthetic image, I think.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you also talk about the ways that some of the names for foods reflect that kind of desire to be more French. I think it's the
Blanquette de veau. Yes.
de veau. So
that's a whole story.
Yeah.
That's a whole story.
They're taking a
First of all, this dish was done with lamb, okay? But when the Jews of Algeria started to Frenchify, they saw the meats that were eaten by Arabs as a handicap to their Frenchification. So they still keep the lamb for Passover, for example, because it's so central in the dinner, Passover dinner. But on these particular dishes, many of the Jews replaced lamb by veal, which is a meat of social and economic emancipation, and upwardness. And so now that they have replaced veal, they had replaced lamb by veal, they can identify the dish to Blanquette de veau, which has nothing to do with that dish. Nothing to do,
I see.
Technically. But it's a sort of recognition of the traditional dish by using a French name to it.
Yeah, now that you tell me about this background in ethnoscience, I understand some of this interest in the relation of language and.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Definitely. So
I got it from André Georges Audricourt,
right,
who was an incredible linguist,
right.
ethnolinguist, ethnobotanist.
Well, one other thing I wanted to ask you about is, we've talked about some of the ways that food was used as part of the Jewish religious tradition to create distinction, and also in relation to their aspiring French identity, but were there ways in which Jews and Muslims in Satif came together through food?
Yes. So I'll give you a couple of ethnographic vignettes.
Okay.
Because I don't want to give you a general narrative.
Sure.
In traditional North African Jewish cuisine, you find a lot of similarities with the Arab cuisine, obviously, because they all went to the same market, right? So in the ingredient components, etc., etc. And the difference between Jewish and Muslim cuisine is that they have slightly different dietary laws, okay? Mm-hmm. So the Muslims don't use pork, obviously, but they do mix dairy and meats,
right?
Okay? So that's what the Jews don't do. Plus, the Muslims eat shellfish, which is prohibited in the Jewish dietary system. But in the house that I have studied through the narratives of former neighbors, so I interviewed the Jewish neighbors in France, and then I went to Algeria twice, and I interviewed the Muslim former neighbors. And on my first visit, which I told you about earlier, very emotional, extremely emotional. When I even wrote about it, and when I speak about it, I become very emotional. Mm-hmm. So after these women gave me a tour of the house with different memories that emerged on each corner that we saw, so I told them that I had to go. The taxi driver was waiting for me outside. And they told me, okay, we're going to give you souvenirs of the Memo, which is the name of the house. They didn't call it by the same name at the time of my visit, But anyway. And so they gave me a challah bread and a house robe for a woman. Mm-hmm. These two objects struck me so much because the challah bread was baked only by Jews in Satif. Mm-hmm. The Arabs would not bake challah, certainly not on Friday. And they didn't know that I was going to visit them. So they had that challah baked. So I supposed that they had been baking challah in memory of their former, I'm sorry, in memory of their former Jewish neighbors.
Wow, that's really...
I mean, how can you not be amazed by collective memory?
That's right, when it's...
They had been eating their former neighborhood all these years. Wow. Okay?
That's so beautiful.
When the Jewish women prepared Sabbath when they were still living in that house, mm-hmm. The Muslim women saw them cook, They saw them preparing for their holidays. And there were certain types of privacy practices, like putting a curtain that was always flying around anyway, right. When the Jews would celebrate their Sabbath dinners or their big holiday dinners like Passover, etc. But the Muslims were there. They could see and they could hear everything. Mm. And so they obviously saw how the Jewish women baked challah, which was totally different from the Arab breads, even at the time of my visit. So that's one example.
Talk about a counter memory, like as they say, like how that goes against the official history and all of that.
I call it the politics of domestic life, which is very often totally different from the politics of governments.
Right.
The politics of relationships between Jews and Muslims until the Jews left the Arab countries en masse, essentially in the after decolonization. Although some of them remained, in Morocco, for example. Well, the politics happened in the house between women.
Right.
They didn't ask if they were supported by a colonial power or anything. They were just acting domestic politics. And that put them very close to each other. I have another example, but I don't know if you want me to tell you.
Sure, go ahead.
Which of relationships between Jews and Muslims during a Jewish holiday. I have a couple of examples, but let's talk about that one, which is the holiday of Mimuna, which is the last day of the Passover week, when Sephardic Jews of all North Africa and the Middle East celebrate the return to the leavened foods. Okay, essentially that's what it is. And Moroccan Jews in particular have very lavish celebrations. In Israel, for example, Mimuna has become long time ago a national holiday where if it's celebrated in a public place, they would invite Arab people, Bedouins, etc., etc. Bon, so before the holiday of Passover, Jewish women would clean their house to remove every trace of leavened food, okay? And they replaced the dishes by Passover dishes that have never been in touch with leaven okay? So many of them had leftovers of non-kosher for Passover food in their cabinets. So what they would do is very often they would give that food to their Muslim neighbors, especially when they live together in the same compound, if you wish. And the last day of Passover, when the Jews return to leavened food, but they don't return to only leavened food. They return to normal relations with their neighbors. So the Arabs very often participated in the celebration of Mimuna by bringing, not returning the exact foods that they were given before Passover, but giving foods that they have baked or, and the Jews would accept them, even though some of them might not have been kosher. I don't know how they solved this issue. But it was essentially, the Mimuna has become a celebration of Jewish, Muslim neighborhood. One forgets when you hear CNN and all, I'm not criticizing CNN particularly, but the Western media, when you hear about hostility between Jews and Muslims, of course in Israel, Palestine, in the Middle East, but also in Western countries where they both immigrated, you have the feeling that is given by reporters and the public powers in general, that these people have always hated each other, but that's not the case. Ethnographers know that very well.
I think of you must know Renee Hirschon and her work on Christian-Muslim relations prior to the population exchange between Greece and Turkey, and I have other social historian colleague who's really documented in depth some of those things, which are very similar to what you're describing. So it really goes against, once again, this idea Greeks and Turks hate each other and all of that.
Yes.
Well.
Anyway.
That's really fascinating. Is there anything else that I didn't cover that you wanted to talk
Oh,
about?
you know, I could speak for
Sure.
2 days, but Sam will get sick of that, probably. I
Well,
don't want him to be sick.
well, why don't we then come to an end? Thank you for
Thank
this
you very much
really
for coming all these
fascinating.
ways.